Okay, so, well, thank you for the introduction. And I suppose today I've been asked just to sort of talk about policing in London, policing in a time of pandemic, and to introduce myself. And I know Roger, sort of a short while ago, was talking about the gold, silver, bronze structure. So currently I'm the gold commander for the Metropolitan Police response to the COVID pandemic, and have been doing this role pretty much since April of this year. So there were two of us initially swapping around, and as things sort of developed, I've effectively taken over the role full time. And in this role, unusually for the Met structure, I'm reporting directly to the Commissioner, who is obviously linked in fully with government and the London government. So I think if we go on to the first slide, I mean, what were our, looking at what our initial thoughts were on the sort of global public health crisis and how this impacted on London. And again, I think I caught the back end of the last presentation talking about strategy. And of course we have a strategy, but this is a strategy unlike any other, in that we had to focus both internally in terms of what our people were going through, who were also potentially victims of this disease, but also externally in the support that we would need to provide for the whole of London. And as I will try and outline, that is unlike anything else we've ever done. So I think if I start with what our initial considerations were, if we wind back right to the very start when we were first sort of talking about this pandemic in January, February sort of time, and a few of us got together and were saying, what does success look like? I think we realised early on this was unlike anything else in that it was a health emergency rather than something where police would naturally take the lead. So in terms of our initial considerations, I think our priorities were firstly to recognising it's a health emergency, to try and make sure that we didn't end up with a policing crisis or a crime crisis or a security crisis at the same time. And as this started, we were trying to look to the future, to get out the crystal ball, to try and understand, would this lead to widespread criminality? Would it lead to looting? Would it lead to disorder? What were the implications of this? Because we really hadn't seen it before. There was no real playbook. I think the next thing we wanted to do was to ensure that we kept our people safe and resilient, because we wouldn't be any use to the public of London if we weren't, and that the public would be reassured by our presence in a fearful time. So we needed to make sure that whilst there's lots of messages around staying at home and working from home, that we remained present and we remained available for the public of London. We also wanted to make sure that we continued to deal with our biggest priorities. And at the moment for the Met, that's violent crime. You may have seen reports around the number of shootings or stabbings that we had in London, certainly in 2019. And it's been very clear that our main strategic objective is to bear down on violence. We didn't want to stop building for the future as well. There's a huge range of transformation programs underway, whether it's new command and control systems, a new integrated platform for crime recording and intelligence. And there was a danger in the outset that we thought that actually some of this might have to stop. The people that were delivering it, the technical specialists, the program and project managers, may not be able to carry on. But we wanted to push that off as long as we possibly could, because we did recognise that this wasn't going to be over quickly. I don't think any of us realised how long we'd still be doing it, but we recognised it was going to be in for the long haul. So if we did stop doing really critical functions and did stop preparing for the future, then that would make it much, much harder to pick up as we entered into recovery. And I think the final point to outline at the start is that what we wanted to do was to come out of this with relationships between the public and the police as good as they went in, or ideally better. We wanted to come out of this with the public thinking better of us than when we went in, and unknowing at the time how big a challenge that would be, because we didn't know whether there would be serious problems around public order or disorder or crime. We didn't know what enforcement meant at the time. Would we be really bearing down and enforcing new regulations against the wider public, which would actually lead us to be significantly unpopular, I expect. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So here what I've outlined is some of the link to the sort of theme of the conference, some of the impact on officers, the change and the uncertainty. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the things that sort of leapt out that I thought actually would be of interest to this group. The first thing that we were faced with, I suppose, is new laws, a new legal framework, and new operational responses. You know, the new laws are pushing elements of policing potentially from the public space, where we are very comfortable and where we deal with all the time, into the more private space, where actually people weren't allowed to do things in their home that previously they had been, which makes that very, very difficult to enforce. So judging that right, it was very, very important. There was confusion between what was guidance and what was regulation. So what was nice to do, what was it you had to do? And that was really important because, again, a lot of the public didn't understand that. And certainly in the early stages, a lot of our officers didn't understand that. A good example is social distancing has always been guidance. We always made it clear to government. It was not within the role or the ability of the police to enforce a 2-meter social distancing rule anywhere. Whereas actually the number of people gathering in a home or the number of people are wearing face masks on public transport is regulation, which means it would be enforceable. And then there's a question mark as to the extent to which you enforce. How much do you need to enforce to retain public confidence that you're doing something, whereas careless, thoughtless over-enforcement could easily alienate whole sections of the community. I think the final legal point is one of rapid change. I mean, I genuinely am not exaggerating. In terms of the changes in the regulations that we've seen, one of them that was coming into effect on a Monday morning at 1 minute past midnight, I was waiting for that until past 11 p.m. on the Sunday night. So we were getting the laws very, very late. The final versions were being issued very late. And the challenge that brings with then briefing your staff and actually transacting that into activity into the public space is very, very difficult. So if I reflect back into lockdown 1, I think the first, obviously everybody knows the timeline of COVID. I'm not going to go through that. We could spend days doing it, talking about what happened when. And one of the things we have done, which I do think is important, is maintaining a really clear corporate record as we've gone along, recording decisions, recording the information at the time, recording the legal framework. Because actually, if we try and look back now, even to May, June time, unless we've got those records, we would never know what legal framework we were operating under. So any subsequent challenge would be really, really hard. And certainly we expect at some point there will be some form of public inquiry. So with lockdown 1, I think the sense of it was that, crikey, this is serious. Actually, more people complied than we thought they would. The measures that were put in place by the government in London were more effective than we could have ever hoped for. And actually, the net result of that was that London was largely deserted for a large period of time. Demand, in terms of general policing demand, was down over 50% in some areas. Robbery was down over 50%. Theft down 40%. As a lot of the businesses, a lot of the nighttime economy that generates that sort of demand was simply closed. And actually, London was eerily quiet. One of our considerations was around our own resilience. I touched on it already. We had a position where our demand was down, but actually our worst case scenario predictions around how many members of our staff and officers would become sick were never met. The Met proved to be very resilient, and the number of officers and staff that went sick remained within manageable levels. So at no point did we have to go through the business continuity plans, working out what we would no longer do. Although those plans were completed and were available on the shelf. So if we had had a huge abstraction rate, we could have prioritized our activity and actually really focused in on what was the life-saving, what was the most critical stuff that we actually do. And we almost got to the point in terms of an exercise where we said, if one person comes to work out of a workforce of 42,000 officers and staff, if one person comes to work, what are they going to do? Well, that one person will answer the phone. And if 2 people come to work, the second person will take a car and answer the most urgent call. And we built it up from there. Impact on officers in wave 1, there was some new stuff. There was a lot of new things that we were doing. A concept called PMART, which was we had quite a few deaths in the community in the early stages, and we were planning for more. So we repurposed a lot of our training units, some of our professional standards teams to become operational and to support the multi-agency response teams that were dealing with COVID deaths in the community, because those who had died from COVID needed to be dealt with in a different way, because actually the transmission risk was extremely high dealing with somebody who had recently died from COVID, and also from the family. So there was additional PPE, there were additional procedures, there was a whole new way of dealing with it, so we could push it through the coroner's process much more quickly. In terms of our staff, those who could work from home, what did we do with those? How did we ensure productivity? How did we ensure contact? And those who were shielding, those that were clinically vulnerable, that were advised by the NHS, by the government, to stay at home. One of our tasks in the early phases of all of this was to find meaningful work, but also to make sure that those people didn't lose contact with the organisation. What was it they could do to support the effort from home? Now, one of the challenges I'll come on to is how we then retract from that position. How do we then get more staff back into the workplace, which is something we'll touch on as we went over the summer. And then the last bit, I think, was how do we stay alert to the community, and what are the sort of quieter, less obvious signals that things are changing. And a good example of that is, some of you may have seen the concept of clap for carers, where people came out on their front doors or onto bridges and clapped for the NHS every Wednesday, I think it was, in the first 10 weeks of this. And how quickly that changed from something that was, hugely beneficial, hugely supported, to something that drew heavy criticism around actually people gathering together, and actually police officers even fueling that. So the quieter risk, the quieter signals, the things that were going to change were really, really important to us. We go to the next slide, please. So I think the next thing is the context. Now, I mention this because I think it's important that when we entered the pandemic, we were already in what I would call quite febrile times. We had been through the difficulty of the last 3.5 years over EU exit. We had a very worried population. We had a very proactive media, but also a media that seems never happy with one thing or another. It didn't matter what anybody did, it was always going to be wrong. And also we had seen in recent years, and possibly linked to sort of patterns going back before 2016 and even the presidential election in 2016, the rise of nationalism and extremism, which is sort of well documented as we move through this period post the Brexit vote towards EU exit. And one of the things we did think of was it was very important that the Met retained its position as an anchor institution for London, as something that's always there, that's a constant, that's reliable, that the public can turn to in times of need, that is going to speak the voice of truth and consistency and coherence in what are very, very difficult times. And that led through to how we enforce the law, I think. And I mean, Martin may have touched on the sort of initial enforcement approach, which was agreed nationally around using the 4 E's, which was how we approached our enforcement activity, whereby we understood that the law was so new and many people just didn't know what it was, that we would engage people, we would explain to them, we would encourage them to comply. And only then, after those 3 things had been done, and actually done pretty exhaustively in the early stages, would we then enforce. And it's fair to say early mistakes were made. There were mistakes made around some of the legislation. Some of the tickets that were issued were done under the Coronavirus Act as opposed to the Health Protection Act regulations. There was a whole range of different offences that some came under an act, some came under regulations, and those regulations changed. And some mistakes were made, but it's learning from those and actually communicating to our staff internally, getting better at communicating, getting better at updating the teams, so the legislation became simpler, so people could understand it. And then I think as the stage 1 sort of moved forward, moving to police protest, we saw protests from fairly early on, from saving our rights to anti-vaccine protests. But the big one, the big protest started from the 25th of May and the death of George Floyd, which just shows how we need to adapt so quickly. And 1 minute we're policing a pandemic, the next minute we're then policing a significant public order challenge. And from the 31st of May, when we saw our first really big protest, we had 6 really big protests in central London, mostly peaceful. But but some that did lead to disorder, some that did lead to criminality, and all of them that were completely against the regulations. But needing to adapt, we had to actually just get on with it. We couldn't enforce against 10,000 people. We couldn't stop the protest happening. And had we tried to do so, that would have led to disorder. And those decisions that were made then are actually still echoing with us now, in that we get regularly the accusation leveled at us that we treat different protest groups differently. We don't. The Met is impartial, the Met is fair, the Met doesn't have a view on the merits of one protest group over another. What we do is we enforce the law. We enforce the principles of human rights. And actually, at the time, at the moment, and during the lockdowns, people's right to assemble has been constrained, and we have tried our best to enforce that. But we can only enforce it when it's enforceable, and when it's enforceable without the risk of very serious disorder or actually very serious damage to community relations. So moving into September, I think new risks have emerged. We've seen, as we've gone through, the sort of spike in the early part of March and April. And since then, there was a de-escalation. And as we de-escalated, we saw people more and more enthusiastic to sort of take the brakes off, to get going, to get back to normal. But that's now changed in September, and that presents new risks. So if we move on to the next slide. So I think, without being overly pessimistic, my sense is that we've got a tough winter coming, and we have a tired workforce with demand not reducing now. In wave one, demand was down 40–50%. In the second wave, it isn't. It's down a little bit, but that was only during the lockdown period. We've spent a lot of time and energy, a lot of our officers' time and energy over the summer policing public order, getting ready for Notting Hill, dealing with Black Lives Matter, dealing with all of the other protests that we get all of the time, as well as supporting the pandemic. So our resilience is lower now than it was at the start of this process. And as we look towards the winter, we've got a conflation of risk. We've got EU exit in not that many days, 20 days or something like that, 21 days. We've got the ordinary winter pressures that will be on the NHS, winter flu, more people getting sick. And we're very firmly into a second or arguably a third wave. And then the what next? So what's the next thing? What's the next thing, the next Black Lives Matter incident, the next George Floyd that's going to come out of left field and sort of affect our sort of flow? The regulations have changed significantly, and again, we've had to adapt from that, even nationally, from a tiering process to alert levels, international restrictions into tiers. And I think there's a dissonance of messages, making things harder to land, harder to hear for the public. Now it's much more nuanced, and people understand it less, in that you can go shopping on the high street, and are encouraged to do so to save the economy, but you can't go out with friends to have dinner in a socially distanced way. You can go to a football match, but you can't have a gathering of more than 6 people in your garden. So the regulations have become harder and harder to enforce. And I think overall we're seeing an erosion of compliance brought about by COVID fatigue. We're seeing more protests, and this goes back to the resilience question. Every 2 weeks there's a big Save Our Rights protest now. On the 5th of November for the Million Masks March, we made 193 arrests. There were about 3,000 people. 28th of November, we made about 150 arrests, dealing with the Save Our Rights group. There's another one scheduled for the 19th of December, and so it goes on. On the positive side, we see the vaccine, and that's brought with it demand. We need to ensure that the vaccine is secure. We need to ensure that people aren't disrupted by anti-vaccine lobbyists or protesters. We need to provide reassurance. And if we enter a higher tier, we need to work with, if the military are deployed in London, which is a very real possibility, to support the mass testing effort or to support the vaccine rollout. We need to be in a position to respond to that. And I think the last point on this, critically, what we need to help do, and this isn't for us to do, but we need to be part of it, going back to our anchor institutional responsibilities, is to help maintain the political consensus. So for those who don't know London, London's made up of 32 different boroughs, all of whom have an individual council and a council leader of differing political parties. We have a London mayor and a Greater London Authority. And then we have at the government level the Minister for London. And all of this needs to be tied together such that we don't end up with the divergence of views or approach that we saw in other parts of the country, where the Metro Mayor was saying one thing and the government was saying another. That would be disastrous for London and actually lead to, I think, widespread non-compliance, would fuel protest and fuel mistrust. So maintaining the political consensus in these very febrile times remains absolutely critical. If you move on to the final slide. Thank you. And so future challenges, and I've touched on the first one already. I think the Met has to, and policing, nationally, internationally, has to continue to be the anchor point, has to continue to be the trusted organisation, has to continue to, in terms of our enforcement, we're enforcing against the most serious, the most willful, the most deliberate, the most egregious breaches. But actually, where people are making mistakes or doing minor things, we're advising them, we're engaging them, we're explaining. So the anchor point is really critical. I think the future challenges are linked to the economy. I think it'll be not lost on anyone worldwide around the economic impact of the virus. And even though the numbers of officers in the Met are growing in the short term, what does actually the economic position mean for the long term of policing? And how do we recover? How do we change to operate from, as we once did, to maintain operating in a COVID secure environment, which means fewer people in the estate? But actually, a lot of our future savings were predicated on estate reduction. So at a time when we've been reducing the estate, we now find that we can fit fewer people into it. So unpicking that as we go forward into 2021 is going to be a challenge. I think the vaccine is a huge source of hope, a huge source of positivity, and actually is the route out of this. But it will only be so if enough people have it, and if we are proactive in dismissing some of the fake news, the rumour, the speculation, the outright lies that are being told about it, that are seeking to sow mistrust, both in this country, in London, and internationally. This risks being another fault line, another divide, as to those who've had it and those who haven't. And what does that mean? Was it those who wanted Brexit, those who didn't? There's been some real difficulty around that sort of division. And we hope that the vaccine doesn't become another source of division in the sort of coming months and years. And what does it mean for our staff? What does it mean for travel? What does it mean for our people who don't want to have it? What will that mean in terms of curtailing what would have otherwise been their rights? The last two bits, I suppose, are external and internal recovery. What looks different? I think we will never go back to the culture of presenteeism. You know, we found I'm talking to you remotely. I'm not sure that would have happened 2 years ago. A lot of our meetings, a lot of my meetings are done on Teams. We're present because I think there's something around senior leaders in the Met where most of our staff are out on the streets 24/7, need to be present. But a lot of our support staff are working remotely and are dialing in. Now, there's a balance to be struck with that, in that I think there does need to be a certain connectivity to the organisation, a connectivity to London, to the public that we serve, but also a pragmatism around we can't fit everybody in. So working remotely is a fantastic way of helping bridge that gap. So things will look different. And I suppose the one thing I hope doesn't happen but will in some form is the recrimination and inquiry. Unquestionably, there will be some form of public inquiry. Our record keeping in this has to be exemplary. Our decisions have to be logged. We have to understand at the time of those decisions what was the prevailing legal framework, what were the operational and environmental conditions. As London faces a deteriorating picture, as I sit here this morning, the news from the weekend, the news on the figure, not good. We are very much, having just stepped out of national restrictions, we are very much moving towards more restrictions in the capital because the numbers are going up, and by more than what we could reasonably manage. So as we run up to Christmas and the balance of optimism, people look forward to seeing their families, and people look forward to some easing, and people look forward to the vaccine. In the immediate term, the policing challenges here and now around how do we support the public of London comply with the regulations to keep them safe. And hopefully, in the long term, the inquiry, it won't be recrimination, but the inquiry will identify learning, will identify what we could have done better. But we'll actually ultimately think that the Met got it just about right. We pitched it just about right. And that's the best we can hope for. So, Bob, with that, I will pause, and apologies went on slightly longer than anticipated, but I'll happily take any questions.
No, Matt, thank you very much. I mean, that was fascinating, and I think we'd love you to go on longer, challenging though it is. I know we do have a really interesting question that I think Karen has got teed up for us. Karen, are you there?
Yeah, Paul, would you like to just share your question with Mr. Twist?
Thanks, Karen. Good morning, Matt. My name's Paul West. I'm a former Chief Constable of West Mercia Police. Thanks ever so much. I don't envy you the last 9 months or so in that particular role, but I'm particularly interested in street violence. So the question is, throughout her tenure, the Commissioner has made it very clear that reducing violence on the streets is her #1 priority. Now, a good proportion of that, although obviously not all, is linked to robberies, gangs, illegal drug distribution. So what I'm fascinated by is, in terms of policing response, during lockdown 1, when we all know that the streets were deserted, what did you learn about the sort of substantial reductions seen in that type of crime in terms of potential future policing?
Well, thanks, Paul. I mean, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw very significant reductions in sort of most of our key indicators, but I suppose there's a couple of things that stood out. So there were a lot less people on the street, firstly, so there were a lot less victims there's a lot less victims available in terms of robbery. So your traditional pattern of sort of robberies within the West End, robberies of tourists, robberies of shoppers, almost evaporated overnight. So there were no people. What we did see, though, was obviously, whilst the shops were closed, the drugs markets weren't able to close, because those that wanted to deal drugs still had to do so. But they became so much easier to spot, in that they were the only people that were out on the streets. So what we saw during lockdown 1 was actually our rate of stop and search increased, and our rate of arrests for drugs possession and drugs possession with intent to supply increased, as police officers, one, had a bit more time. So one thing we absolutely saw was that officers had more time to be proactive, and they were doing more stop and search activity, which led to more arrests for drug dealing, which led to fewer people on the street, which actually led to a significant reduction in crime. I think in terms of the violence bit, one thing we were consistent with, so throughout, our violent crime task force hasn't been diverted to do anything else. There's a real temptation around, well, we need officers to do body recovery, we need officers to do this, we need officers to help with the SCG, we need officers to deal with gatherings or to patrol public spaces. And we didn't use the violent crime task force for that. We used a lot of our supporting structures, our professionalism, learning and development, training, transformation. And actually, where we saw demand significantly reduce, to give an example of aviation security. I mean, the demand at Heathrow and London City airports literally evaporated overnight. So actually, the airport operator was very keen for us to use some of those officers, because that meant for that period of time they weren't paying for them. So our royalty and specialist protection, members of the royal family, members of cabinet ministers weren't travelling around. They were all in situ. So we had a lot of officers from specialist operations that were actually brought in to support this as well, which brought some interesting challenges around trying to find them a uniform, trying to find them cars, and it was interesting, but actually it was so worth it, because actually those that did it actually found that they enjoyed it. And now in wave 2, whilst we're not making them do it because the demand hasn't come out, we've actually got people volunteering from specialist posts to come in and help. So I think you're right, Paul. The focus on violence has remained the #1 priority and does remain so, because it is the most, the scourge of sort of violence, the deaths of young men in London is absolutely what we need to spend our most of our effort dealing with. But I think, lockdown 1, it was, I think it's what I've said really. I don't think there's much more I can add to that. Both the environmental, the operational, circumstances came together led that we were able to make a big difference.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thanks very much. Great answer. Thank you. And very interesting to know that throughout all of that, the Violent Crime Task Force stayed in place. I think that's a really important point you've made. Thank you.
Matt, sadly, time is against us, mate.
Okay.
I've got 1,001 questions, but I'll perhaps come and see you over a coffee. Matt,
Yeah, we'd love to.
Matt, thank you so much, not just for your time today and in giving us that fascinating insight, but for everything you and your colleagues do for everybody in London. And as a Londoner myself, the men and women in the Metropolitan Police are still playing a blinder, and I'm sure they will continue to do so. So, Matt, thanks ever so much. I really do appreciate that.
Thanks very much, Bob. Good to see you.